Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the annual Aylmer lecture hosted by the Department of History. I'm Laura Stewart and I'm the head of the Department of History. I just have a couple of things to say before we embark on this evening's proceedings, just a little bit of housekeeping. This event is being live streamed and a warm welcome to all of you who are joining us online. For those of you who are here in the Bowland, please be aware that you could be visible on camera. And if you don't want your image recorded, then we can reseat you. Please can you make yourself known discreetly to Cathy Moore, who will wave at you now, and we'll be able to sort that out. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Bowland, if you need to use the toilets, they are in the atrium outside this lecture, straight through the double doors and directly opposite you. And again, if you need anything, Cathy Moore will be happy to help. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here this evening to introduce Professor Steve Hindle, currently W.M. Keck Foundation Director of Research at the Huntington Library, California. With its unique collections of 16th and 17th century material, housed in a purpose-built library set amidst the stunning gardens of the Huntington estate, and by the way, it's in LA, many early modernists think that Steve probably has the best job in the world. But after a decade in post, and having overseen the expansion of the Huntington's Fellowship Program and its conference and lecture series, Steve is leaving California for Washington University in St. Louis, where he's been appointed as the first Derek Hurst Professor in Early Modern History, and we congratulate Steve on that wonderful appointment. On this side of the Atlantic, Steve is best known as a pioneering historian of English social and economic history. After studying for a master's at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis, Steve returned to England and to Cambridge, where he completed his PhD under the supervision of Keith Wrightson in 1992. Steve joined the Department of History at Warwick University in 1995, where he tells me he had 6 years of research leave. I haven't had that in my career. And he was then appointed to a professorship in 2004. I first encountered Steve's work as a doctoral student with an interest in governance and political culture. The State and Social Change in Early Modern England, published in 2000, opens with a matter-of-fact statement that belies how transformative Steve's research would be for debates about the nature of state power. This is a book about the role played by relatively humble people in governing late 16th and early 17th century England. It emphasises the extent to which state authority required cooperation at the local level. Relatively humble people and the local level. These two phrases are key. For an older generation of political historians, and I must cite here the historian after whom this lecture is named, the first professor of history at the University of York, Professor Gerald Aylmer, the state meant the institutions of central government, and its evolution was characterised by increasing bureaucratisation. The relationship between centre and locality was implicitly antagonistic. The centre imposed things on truculent localities. Governing elites, happily cocooned within their county boundaries, did their level best to thwart irritating central initiatives to rationalise England's patchwork of legal and administrative jurisdictions. And as a head of department in a large university, I can see some parallels. Steve's deep research into the administration of the parish, and especially local judicial processes, required us to reimagine the early modern state. State power was not imposed on those relatively humble people. Its authority was appropriated by a middling sort with what Steve describes as an almost obsessive concern with social order. The English state was participatory and its power was negotiated. Indeed, it had to be, because early modern governments actually weren't very powerful at all, lacking, as they did, a standing army or a police force to compel people to do what they were told. What was remarkable about the English state was its social depth. Lots of people engaged with the state, especially through recourse to the law. This was, as all early modern historians know, a highly litigious age. The state, according to Steve Hindle then, was not straightforwardly coercive and oppressive, but that did not mean it lacked coercive aspects, and the people who felt it were those very many English people who at some point in their lives experienced poverty. In a series of case studies, culminating in the second book on the parish, The Micropolitics of Poor Relief in Rural England, circa 1550 to 1750, published in 2004, Steve elucidated the informal networks and bonds of association that enabled subordinate groups to subsist. On the parish showed how the appropriation of state authority helped to consolidate the identity and status of the middling sort by giving them the means to exercise control over their subordinates. The expansion of the English Poor Law narrowed the options available to those in poverty and made relief dependent on their adherence to the social norms imposed by their betters, the so-called Reformation of Manners. Despite the demands of leading one of the world's leading research libraries, Steve has remained first and foremost an historian of the English people, of the economic changes that transformed the social world, of the social dimensions to what used to be conceived of as political questions, and of the role of litigation in shaping England's political culture. In addition to his major monographs, colleagues in this room will be familiar with his important edited collections, The Experience of Authority in Early Modern England with Paul Griffiths and Adam Fox, and with Alex Shepherd and John Walter, a festschrift of Keith Wrightson, Remaking English Society, Social Relations and Social Change in Early Modern England. In 2015, Steve won the Pacific Coast Conference on British Studies Prize for his article Representing Rural Society, Labour, Leisure and the Landscape in an 18th Century Conversation piece. Before concluding, I want to say that I think one of the things that makes, for people like me, what makes Steve an historian's historian is his deep knowledge of the archive and his evident excitement in the discoveries to be made there. And Steve's work is always rooted in the sources. Today, Steve returns to the historian's never-ending fascination with the attempt to comprehend the lived experiences of the relatively humble people who lived in a society superficially recognisable to us today, and yet in so many other ways, another world. The lecture that Steve is going to give this evening is part of the book that he's about to publish, and I need the title, with OUP, and is it the same title?
The Social Topography of a Rural Community.
The Social Topography of a Rural Community. Tonight, Steve is talking to us on the subject of writing the biographies of the overlooked, the case of the village Stonemason. Please help me welcome Professor Steve Hindle.
Wow. Thank you, Laura, for that humbling introduction. I'm really delighted to be here. It's my first time back in the UK for 3 years, so this is a really welcome opportunity to reconnect with old friends, so many of whom are in the room here this evening. I have a number of thank yous to offer. First to my former doctoral student, Heather Folvey, who's out there in Zoom land with her local history students in Oxford. I hope you can hear me and see me, Heather. I'm really looking forward to seeing you next week. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for all your research assistance on this project. To Matthew Enger, who I believe is still in New Haven, Connecticut, working on his doctoral project. It was Matthew who drew the remarkable maps that you're about to see during the course of this presentation, and without whom this project would not have been possible. And then to my extraordinary assistant, Catherine Werry Miller, who put together the really remarkable slide deck. Most of all to Laura and her colleagues for the warm welcome, and especially for the opportunity to give a talk in honour of Gerald Aylmer, whom I had the great good fortune to get to know towards the end of his career and of his life. He was Master of St Peter's College in Oxford at the time when that college hosted what had become known as the Oxford Discussion Group on the English State, which Joe Inners and I chaired or co-chaired for several years together. And Gerald was a wonderfully warm, generous and curious presence on all of those occasions during those annual meetings of that ongoing seminar. So it's a real privilege to give a talk in his honour. In early December 2000, in almost the final sentences he ever wrote, Gerald Aylmer offered a very last word, as he called it, on prosopography. He noted that the technique of collective biography, as he put it, seeking to collect, verify and present a minimum amount of information about the lives and careers of a relatively large number of people, had by then long been established, both in history and in applied social studies. It was typically generous and historiographically sensitive of Gerald to recognise that the method of collective biography had been successfully applied to many other social groups and categories in early modern times, way beyond the servants of the state with whom he himself had been preoccupied, extending even to what he called the humblest inhabitants of some English villages. He had in mind, of course, Alan Macfarlane's Earl's Colne, Margaret Spufford's Chippenham, Willingham and Orwell, and most famously Keith Wrightson and David Levine's Tarling. Gerald nonetheless insisted that although prosopography was one technique for deepening and extending our knowledge of the past, it is not a substitute for other approaches, among which he included individual biography in depth, local and family histories, political narrative, constitutional analysis, intellectual, religious and economic history, or cultural studies. Even so, he knew that nobody would have much time or use for the 3-volume opus, which was essentially his life's work, unless they regarded prosopography as an acceptable and worthwhile method for the historian. So, taking my cue from Gerald's insights and achievements, I offer here an experiment in popular prosopography, what you might call prosopography from below. What follows is extracted from a collective biography of 780 men, women and children scattered across 176 households in one English village at one point in time. Whether it amounts in microcosm to total history, an ideal to which Gerald thought most historians could only ever aspire without actually attaining, is a moot point. Either way, I offer it in memory of an historian whom I was proud to call my friend. So my title is Writing the Biographies of the Overlooked, and I intend here overlooked in 2 separate but related senses. First, my subjects have been historically overlooked, historiographically overlooked, in the sense of being neglected, subject, in E.P. Thompson's famous ringing phrase, to the enormous condescension of posterity, thought by and large either not worth study or incapable of studying. Most of the work that's been done to challenge that assumption has been work on collectivities of various kinds, and especially on those who fell foul of the social and political authorities. And what follows here in trying to reconstruct the biographies of the historiographically neglected, it's important to stress that the people with whom I'm concerned are by and large unremarkable. And they're certainly not malefactors or rioters of the kind which so preoccupied Thompson and his students. I also mean overlooked, however, in the sense of being subject to surveillance. The lives of my subjects were captured in a precocious example of a parish census, what the Cambridge Group for the History of Population and Social Structure came to call in the 1960s an occupational census type listing, which was drawn up for one particular Warwickshire village in the 1st or 2nd week of December of 1684. This village is one of 24 from the 16th and 17th centuries to have occupational data of this kind. These censuses were drawn up for various reasons, and I can say more in Q&A about why this census was created at this point in time for this particular village. The talk is part of a larger project to reconstruct the social topography of a particularly well-documented 17th century English village. Substantively, the book, which is in press with OUP at the moment, consists of 12 chapters, each of which takes one of the 176 households recorded in the census as emblematic of the broader pattern of social, economic, and spatial relations. It's a unique study made possible by a unique archive. As I've said, 24 16th and 17th century villages have the occupational data. This is the only one of those villages which also has a contemporary map, as you'll see. That makes it possible to reconstruct not only who did what for a living in this village, but also to work out who lived next door to whom, and even, as we shall see, who sat next to whom in the parish church. The biographies of my subjects are inevitably structured through the rites of passage associated with the life cycle: baptism, marriage, childbirth, churching, burial. But they are also, first, spatial. I'm concerned to locate my protagonists in the landscape through the use of the contemporary map and in the built environment through the systematic and rigorous exploitation of a remarkably large sample of probate inventories. My biographies are also, however, material. I'm especially interested, as you'll hear, in the materiality of work, in what the archaeologist Tim Ingold so resonantly described in 1992 as the taskscape. Now, there's a separate talk out there somewhere, I think, about why and how historians have so belatedly come to terms with Ingold's insights about what he called the temporality of the landscape. It's a curious tale. If you go to Google Scholar, you'll see that Ingold's article has something like 7,000 citations out there in the humanities and social sciences literature. Ingold was very aggressive in his dismissal of the historical capacity to reconstruct taskscapes. He thought only archaeologists had the technical expertise to reconstruct the ways in which taskscapes reshaped the local landscape and environment. My argument, however, is that despite the lack of any substantive archaeological evidence for the site with which I'm concerned, historians really can reconstruct the taskscape of labourers and craftsmen in 17th century England, provided that they engage in rigorous analysis of an appropriate body of documentary source material, that they engage in spatially sensitive nominal record linkage, with the emphasis here on spatially sensitive, and thirdly, with a relentless focus on the material evidence of lived experience. You'll hear a lot about materiality. My chapters in the book are concerned with the miller, the ribbon weaver, the alehouse keeper, the blacksmith, the nail maker, the collier, the carpenter, the yeoman, the husbandman, and the vicar. But my concern today is with the village stonemason, Andrew Hardy, born in January 1643 and died in February 1702. So let me start off by parachuting you in to the parish of Chilvers Coton. So this is what Jonathan Bate famously called Deep England. This community is in the northeast part of Warwickshire. It's about as far from the sea in any direction you can get in England. It's not only deep England in the sense of La France profonde, as Bate put it, but it's also deepest, darkest England, for reasons which will become clear. The parish of Chilvers Coton in the northeast of the county sits on the Warwickshire coalfield. It's immediately to the north of a coal mining community that was so saturated with coal dust that it became known as Black Bedworth. And this becomes apparent when you look at the first printed map of Warwickshire dating from 1730. This was drawn by and engraved by Henry Bayton, who was actually a Chilvers Coton inhabitant himself. Henry Bayton was born in Griff here in 1687. He went on to become a Fellow of the Royal Society. The village of Chilvers Coton extends here, just about see its boundaries. It's immediately to the southwest of the market town of Nuneaton. You can see here, running north to south, the Warwickshire coal seam, which splinters to the surface in that coal mining hamlet of Griff, which becomes one of the most productive of the coal mines in 17th century and early 18th century England. You see the parish church of All Saints, the water mill, Cuttle Mill on the eastern part of the parish boundary. The whole parish is dominated by the landed estate of the Newdigate family, Arbury Hall, which the Newdigates had owned since 1586. This is also, however, an environment which is very well known to 19th century literary historians, because in 1819, Mary Ann Evans was born just about here to the east of Griff, and Mary Ann Evans grew up to be George Eliot. So my project has a literary afterlife, and Eliot's emphasis on the 4/5 of the English population recorded in the recent census who may be regarded as unremarkable is something of a leitmotif for my thinking about this particular community. If you look at the parish in more detail, we can say something about its economic geography. Essentially, there are 3 settlements in this community extending across its 4,000 odd acres. In the northeast part of the parish, immediately to the south of Nuneaton, is the densely settled, highly nucleated settlement of Coton Town, which is surrounded by a common field system which goes unenclosed until parliamentary statute encloses the common fields and wastes in 1764. And you can see that each of these dots here represents one of the households in the landscape. Further to the south, the coal mining community of Griff, with its coal mines immediately to the north, Arbury Hall and its surrounding domain, and then a number of scattered farmsteads across the western part of the parish, extending into the woodland and ultimately to the parish boundary at Nuthurst Heath. So it's a topographically differentiated community. The land in the parish was largely, though not exclusively, owned by the Newdigate family, who, as I say, had bought the Arbury Hall estate in 1586. Again, this is a really rather beautiful illustration by Henry Baton in 1708. Notes the heavily manicured lawns, the water feature in the foreground, the stable block in the top left, to which I will return later, the kitchen gardens immediately to the east of the house. I know so much about this village that I can tell you that this guy driving the coach is Richard Drakeford, who was born in the village in 1664 and whose father was one of the jurors who collected the information on which this evening's talk is based. This stable block, is 3,800 square feet and 2 stories. It's the kind of stable block you get if Christopher Wren designs it for you. So I need to say something about the man who owned this estate, and that doesn't come easy for me. Sir Richard Newdigate is the 2nd Baronet of Arbury Hall. His dates are 1644 to 1710. In Gerald Aylmer's terms, Newdigate was a failed servant of the state, perhaps even a failed servant of a failed state, who retired to his Warwickshire manor house as a political outcast in 1681. He's on the wrong side of the confessional and political disputes of the early 1680s. He's later accused of implication in the Rye House plot. And he finds himself on his Warwickshire estate in the early 1680s, twiddling his thumbs, but with very, very considerable entrepreneurial ambitions, especially to reopen the coal mines in the southern part of the parish, which have been dormant for 30 years. He is the worst kind of control freak. That is, one with time on his hands. And he spends 3 years orchestrating a manorial survey which generates the archive on which this talk is based. It would be very, very easy, and indeed it was my original intention when this project was very first conceived, almost 15 years ago, to tell the story of this village through the eyes of the landlord. But I'm determined not to do that, to avoid the vertical perspective and to think about movement through the community laterally from the point of view of the inhabitants themselves. So the manorial survey, begun in 1681, concluded in 1684, was typical of centuries of manorial practice. It tasked the Court of Survey with everything that you would expect manorial jurors to be collecting information about. The meres and bounds of the manors, the meres and bounds of the parish, the access to mineral rights, the terms on which land was held or rented, the services that were due to the landlord, the mineral resources that were dispersed across the estate. None of this is at all surprising. It includes a list, as we see here, of the houses as they stand in Griff, Arbury and the Woodland, which lists the tenants, a description of the location and the landlord. And you'll notice that in the vast majority of cases, the landlord is Sir Richard Newdigate, or abbreviated to Sir R.N. Right at the bottom of that listing, you can see Andrew Hardy, a small farm, landlord Sir Richard Newdigate. This listing is drawn up in July of 1684. We know that Andrew Hardy was a mason because of the occupational census type listing, which was included in the manorial survey and created some 5 months later in December of 1684. And here you see Andrew Hardy in household number 99, described as a mason aged 41. He is, however, described elsewhere in the archive as a bricklayer. And it's interesting that the terms stonemason and bricklayer are interchangeable in this archive. This is a built environment in which there's a great deal of resources of clay, a lot of tile making and a lot of brick making. Warwickshire is, in the terms of the historians of vernacular architecture, crossing the brick threshold at the end of the 17th century. And Andrew Hardy, as we'll see, is one of the agents in that process. We can be very precise about the location of Andrew Hardy's farm. This is Matthew Enger's extraordinary digital reconstruction of the parish of Chilvers Coton. You probably recognise the shape of the parish boundary from the 1730 map. We will do a close-up in a minute, but you can see that for every single household in Griff, in Coton Town and in the Woodland, I've got a name and an occupation. We'll zoom in a moment. Andrew Hardy is here, one of two houses settled together to the north of the Arbury estate. There are 3 stonemasons in the village, and their locations are given here. One at Keelings Green in the Woodland, one at the Heath End in Coton Town, and Andrew Hardy himself. There are also no fewer than 4 carpenters in this parish. So there's a very significant demand for building craftsmen in this particular community. Carpenters were architectural woodworkers, essentially, so they're building houses. Hardy's farm is relatively isolated. You can see he's got one immediate neighbour, Alexander Knight, labourer. Xander Knight is almost certainly working on Hardy's farm with him, at least until he was dismissed from his tenancy for stealing stone from his landlord. This map is based on the original 1684 survey map by Thomas Hewitt. This is a detail of part of it, the central part of Coton Town. You can see the strips in the common fields extending either side of Windmill Field Lane, and the vernacular architecture of the houses sketched in some detail. Number of chimneys, number of windows, number of bays, red roofs indicating that the roofs were tiled rather than thatched on this particular map. Hewitt, however, did not succeed in drawing a map of the whole parish. He sketched a map of the Arbury domain where Andrew Hardy lived, and you can see right at the top of the slide there a very simple sketch of the 2 buildings of Andrew Hardy's farm and then the 28 acres which surround it. It would have been absolutely lovely had Hewitt concluded this map, but there was enough here for Matthew Enger to do a fantastic job on the digital reconstruction. So Hardy is farming about 28 acres, most of it pasture, at an annual rent to Sir Richard Newdigate of £11. Was he a mason who farmed, or a farmer who engaged in building work, a question to which we shall return. So here he is again in the occupational census type listing of December 1684. And you can see the detail in which each of the 176 households in the parish is recorded. Andrew Hardy, mason, 41. Anne, his wife, aged 39. Sarah, aged 5. Anne, aged 4. Richard, aged 2. Andrew Jr., 8 weeks. This is one of the reasons why we can be so very precise about the dating of the census itself, because we can cross-reference this document with the parish registers, which give the details of the baptisms. Only his wife, Anne, was a native of Chilvers Coton. She was born Anne Hall and had grown up in the woodland to the west of the farmhouse. Only their 2 youngest children were baptised in the parish. Andrew himself appears to have been from Mickleover in Derbyshire. He probably came to Chilvers Coton in the mid-1670s because of the demand for bricklaying labour at Arbury Hall. This census, though, is only a snapshot. There are 4 children in December 1684, but we know that by 1691 there were 7. One of those children was called Andrew, and he was much younger than the Andrew recorded here, which suggests that Andrew Hardy Jr., 8 weeks old in the census, had not survived very long. We know that the house was relatively cramped. It was listed and assessed at 1/2 in the half tax of 1674. We know from the probate material that it had 6 rooms, including 3 upstairs chambers, only 2 of which were used for sleeping space, much of which will have been shared. We also know from the manorial survey what the layout and distribution of the seats in the parish church was. The figures the names in blue here are of male parishioners. Those in pink, sorry for the stereotyping, are female parishioners. You can see that generally wives sit to the rear of their husbands. Some pews, Temple House, Cuttle Mill, are allocated to specific buildings. Andrew Hardy sits in this pew here uniquely with his wife, which is interesting. In most cases, there is a segregation of parents, of husband and wife. It's also worth noting that there are no pews at all on this particular pew plan for the Newdigate family themselves. Although the chancel belongs to them by right, there are no Newdigate pews here at all. The Newdigate family generally worships in their own private chapel at Arbury Hall, leaving the parishioners here in All Saints. So the demand for building craftsmanship at Arbury is largely created by the construction of this stable block. And although my image is beginning to pixelate at this resolution, you get a very, very good sense of its architecture. It was begun in 1675 and concluded in 1678. In 1674, Christopher Wren thought that Sir Richard Newdigate's masons were, quote, men such as could read in no book but their own, unquote. And it's probable that Andrew Hardy was recruited from a neighbouring estate to provide greater expertise and judgment than was available amongst the versatile masons who already lived in the parish. Hardy first appears in the building records in 1675, and the first payments accounted for his wages in 1677. Here he is, being offered 26 weeks at 9 shillings a week. That's 18 pence per day. He earned £12 in 1677 alone from the Newdigate estate. Notice to the right here, we have 7 carpenters listed, all of whom are making less, or most of whom are making much less than Andrew Hardy was making at 18 pence for 26 weeks. Notice too, you can just about make out Abraham Checkley, who is a labourer and the subject of one of my other chapters, is serving Hardy at 7 pence a day. Arbury Hall was his main, but by no means exclusive, source of employment. By the early 1680s, he was one of the most well-respected and well-compensated members of the Arbury estate workforce. Intriguingly, he is regularly referred to in Sir Richard Newdigate's journal, not by his surname, as all the other craftsmen and labourers are, but by his first name. He's consistently referred to as Andrew, a very unusual use in the estate archive of a Christian name. The only one of the dozens of Arbury Hall employees that Newdigate referred to by his first name, which suggests a close, perhaps even friendly relationship. In Sir Richard Newdigate's journal, Saturday the 30th of June 1683, Newdigate recorded that he had directed Andrew about the sink until dinner time. Monday the 10th of September 1683, Newdigate visited Andrew at the steps. Monday the 24th of September 1683, Newdigate walked out to Andrew at the pheasant yard wall in the bird cage garden. It was only a short walk to Arbury, perhaps 3/4 of a mile. By the late 1680s, Hardy was earning far more than anybody else in the estate workforce, 18p a day, when the labourers were on 10p and the carpenters on 12p. In July 1689, we know from the estate wages book, he was working the longer 12-hour days typical of the summer months. He was tasked with mending 2 chambers at Arbury and with coping the walls by the Fristow barn and by the Green Walk moat. In October 1689, he did shorter working days, more typical of the winter. 6 days together with his apprentice and a building labourer, what we would call a builder's mate, at the moat by the Green Walk and at the bridge that led into Seaswood. Between Lady Day 1689 and Lady Day 1690, he worked directly for Newdigate for 160 days during that year. That's 51% of the theoretical maximum, and earned a total of £12. All this, of course, raises the interesting question, what's he doing with the rest of his time? Is he doing building work for other clients across the parish, or is he primarily engaged in farming? An issue to which I shall return. So the tasks that Andrew Hardy was charged to undertake were varied but predictable. He was required, in particular, to build walls, and it's likely that most of his construction was in brick rather than in stone. His fundamental technique, spreading a trowelful of mortar on top of the last course and adding another brick, was essentially timeless, and it's recognisable today. Though early modern bricklaying was a process slowed down by reliance on lime mortar rather than cement, and by the use of irregular shaped bricks. Hardy might have been expected to lay as many as 250 bricks a day, though he isn't paid at piece rates, interestingly, which, given the constraints of the material with which he was working, was a not inconsiderable benchmark of productivity. He would have used not only a trowel and a brick hammer, quote, longer in the face part and much stronger than other tradesmen's hammers, having a long pick at the contrary end of it and a strong wooden handle, but also brick axes, a brick jointer to rub and polish the joints of brickwork, a brick bat, line pins, a pair of moulding boards, a plane or slice, and of course, a hod. Occasionally, he would have worked on ladders or scaffolds secured with putlocks or spars. He doubtless had experience in the typology of mortar, especially in striking the appropriate balance between sand and lime, and in the desirability of adding small stones when filling the middle of a wall, or horse dung when plastering the inside of chimneys. His laying techniques ranged from what contemporaries called banding, headering, stretchering, cloisering, and coping, through chamfering, splaying, and priming, all of them intended to prevent overhangs or bulges. His apprentice, Charles Hall, who was also actually his nephew, doubtless laid bricks too, but he was likely required to mix mortar and to count and pile bricks, and perhaps even to riddle lime and sand if the masons were not accompanied on any specific site by a labourer appointed to carry out these less skilled tasks. Of quite like this depiction of an 18th century bricklayer with his apron. We know a great deal about Andrew Hardy's working life because of his probate inventory, which was drawn up in March 1702. Very interestingly, it lists no mason's tools at all and refers to him not as a bricklayer or a stonemason, as he'd been referred to in the 1684 census, but as a yeoman. This raises the interesting question of whether he had recently retired. If so, that retirement had only taken place very recently, because he is listed in the Arbury estate accounts right to the end of the 1690s. The inventory actually suggests a very significant dairying operation in which his wife, Anne Hardy, and their daughters would play the leading role. Now, there's much more that can be said here about the role of women's work. And part of the challenge of this particular project is to do justice to the extraordinary economic significance of women's work in these households. In many cases, women's work is hidden behind the occupational designation of the male breadwinner. 16 of the households in Chilvers Coton are headed by widows. Only one of those individuals has another occupation, and she's the alehouse keeper. But for the vast majority of the households in the community, you get a distorted picture of the household economy by focusing exclusively on the occupation associated with the male breadwinner, rather than taking into account the significance of women's work, especially in dairying. Dairying was widely regarded as the art of women and the business of men. George Eliot famously described the dairies and butteries of this part of Warwickshire as temples of moist cleanliness. I love that phrase. You can see here, or you will when I move to the transcript in a moment, that the buttery contained 4 barrels, 2 tubs, 1 churn, and 3 pails. In the back room was a cheese press, 2 wheels with other lumber, which suggests perhaps that spinning was undertaken when there was a lull in the winter months in cheese making. In the chamber over the back room, there were 40 cheeses worth £1 16 shillings. The inventory lists 4 cows, 3 heifers, and 4 yearlings, a relatively small herd. But since each cheese is the product of a day's milking, the cheeses were therefore relatively small. Think in terms of goat's cheese, rather than in terms of large wheels of cheddar. The cheeses were probably not large enough to be shipped to market in London, but maybe were sold at Atherstone Cheese Fair, about 9 miles distant, finding markets along the Trent Valley in Gainsborough and Hull. This is what Defoe suggests about Warwickshire cheese in the early 18th century. In another adjacent household in the parish, at Temple House in the Woodland, Mary King, the wife of a husbandman, was maturing much larger cheeses of far greater value, and those probably were marketed in London. Note too the presence of a bull, a sign of prosperity in its own right. The bull may have been in demand from neighbours who wanted to rent it as they sought to expand their own dairy herds. The inventory contains a very limited amount of grain, which is partly a function of the seasonality of the listing, which, as you can see, was taken in March, and of the limited availability of arable land in this part of the parish. The soil was thin and sour, and significant ploughing fees were payable to the landlord. There were also 2.5 flitches of bacon, suggesting that the family had owned swine, which had been slaughtered at Martinmas and produced enough preserved meat to be stored some 5 months later. Almost certainly, Andrew and Anne Hardy had been intending to buy more pigs in the new year. But then, in the winter of 1701, 2 tragedies intervened. Anne Hardy died at the age of 56 in mid-December 1701, leaving her husband with 7 children aged between 22 and 10, 2 of whom suffered significant disabilities. Andrew Hardy did not survive his late wife long. He made his will, being sick and weak in body, on the 29th of January, 1702. He made special provision for 3 of his 7 children. To his son James, who was lame, £15, he being the less capable of shifting for himself. To his daughter Anne, £10, in respect of her sickly constitution. To his son Andrew Jr., £5 to put him to trade. The residue to be divided amongst all 7 children, share and share alike. Andrew Hardy died just a week later. He was buried at All Saints on the 6th of February 1702, less than 7 weeks after his wife. He was 59 years old. Although the Newdigates did not usually worship, as I've said, at All Saints, one wonders whether Sir Richard Newdigate attended the funeral of his trusted employee and friend. Hardy's inventory suggests enormous wealth. His total inventory value was £313, which places him in the very highest wealth category of all the testators in the Chilvers Coton sample. Only 3 other testators in 17th century Chilvers Coton were appraised at more than £300, and only one, John Newdigate himself of Arbury Hall, his landlord's great uncle, had movable assets valued at more than Andrew Hardy's. This enormous sum might suggest exemplary skill and reward. It might even suggest significant entrepreneurialism. But we need to take very serious notice of Andrew Hardy's very high credit to asset ratio. 79.1% of all his worth was credit, that is to say, debts owing to him. The local average in my sample was 37%, so there's an enormous amount of his wealth is tied up in debts owed to him. He was owed almost £248 upon bonds and desperate debts. You can see them listed here at the bottom of the inventory, and it's a real shame that the inventory does not distinguish between the bonds and the desperate debts. It would be really lovely to work out who exactly owed him what. Much of what he was owed is almost certainly unpaid building wages from the Arbury estate itself. Sir Richard Newdigate was so close to insolvency in the late 1690s that he was paying all his employees in tickets that could be redeemed for corn rather than in cash, in a primitive version of what later became known as the truck system. There's a chronic problem of indebtedness and shortage of specie compounding one another in the 1690s. So the life chances of Andrew Hardy's children evidently depended on how much of that debt might be recovered. The worst case scenario, with no debts collected at all, would have left only £65 to divide between the children, leaving the residual legatees with a little over £7 each. The lack of a probate account, which is the source to which we would usually turn if we sought to reconstruct the way in which the estate actually played out, makes it difficult to tell. But the evidence does suggest that Andrew Hardy did succeed, in Ralph Jocelyn's terms, of successfully setting his children forth in the world. James Hardy survived into adulthood and lived long enough to marry the daughter of a Bedworth stonemason and to appraise the inventory of one of his neighbours in 1721. Richard Hardy was sufficiently well regarded to be a witness to the will of no lesser a personage than Sir Richard Newdigate, the 3rd baronet, in 1723. There was also a tangible return on the investment of £5 in a premium for Andrew Jr.'s apprenticeship. Although Mason's tools were conspicuous by their absence from Andrew Hardy's inventory, Andrew Jr. may well have inherited them, for by the time he married at the age of 32 in 1720, he described himself as a mason and did so again in a testamentary case of 1745. Andrew Hardy Jr. was almost certainly responsible for building the Chilvers Coton parish workhouse in the early 1720s, a project which required 38,000 bricks and 8,000 tiles and earned him just over £11. At his death, aged 72, in 1760, Andrew Hardy Jr. had movable assets worth £154 and was able to make a cash gift of £30 to his daughter, though like his father, he was at that point described as a yeoman. The prosperity of his offspring notwithstanding, Andrew Hardy Sr. had something else to be proud of. He was the only inhabitant of 17th century Chilvers Coton to leave a memorial in the local landscape. The built environment of Chilvers Coton has been successively decimated in 3 waves. First, by the Victorian railway engineers who built viaducts through it. Secondly, by the Luftwaffe in the 1940s, who were bombing Coventry munitions factories. And then in the 1980s, by the Thatcher government's determination to take on the National Union of Mine Workers, which eviscerated what was left of what had once been a prosperous coal mining community. So much of the village has been destroyed. But Andrew Hardy's achievement is still there in the landscape, some 350 years later, offering architectural testimony to his craftsmanship as a bricklayer. If his monument is sought, look no further. The master mason had made his mark. Let me conclude then. I hope it's implicit, at least, that what I've been able to do here for Andrew Hardy could be done for any number of the other inhabitants of this particular village, given the remarkable source base of material that I have available to me. In several respects, Hardy's career is one of the relatively easy ones to reconstruct. I have probate material for him, for instance. Putting together the chapter on the agricultural labourer was much more difficult for obvious reasons. But I think the case does show, even so, just how much it is possible to know about an otherwise obscure, overlooked individual, especially if you spend over a decade doing it, well beyond the administrative and fiscal reach of the RAF police state known as Research England. Just how much cannot be known, I think, is also important. And that's the paradox of microhistory. The closer the focus on the archival detail, the more obvious the gaps in the evidence become. And that's the challenge. When does rigorous archival work shade into informed speculation, or what a new generation of African American historians have come to call critical fabulation? What don't we and can't we know? How did Andrew Hardy grieve when he buried his infant son, Andrew? What killed him and Anne so suddenly in the winter of 1701-2? We can speculate which of his customers, co-workers and neighbours he counted as his friends. We might wonder whether he frequented the alehouse in the Bullring at Coton Town to socialise with the labourers and metal workers who were its regular customers. And as I've already implied, we might speculate too whether Sir Richard Newdigate really did attend his funeral at All Saints. But we can be sure, I think, that Andrew Hardy was an exceptional norm, or a normal exception. Exceptional only to the extent that he's exceptionally well documented. We can be sure that he was broadly typical of the unsung craftsman who played such a significant social and economic role in the rural communities where they dwelled, and who forged and fabricated their material culture with the tools that they wielded with such expertise. Thank you for listening. So I would be very happy to take questions, but I have one prerequisite, and that is that you all take a self-denying ordinance. Nobody in this room is allowed to say, Steve, you've got such great material, because I know I've got fantastic material. My material is so fantastic, it's an embarrassment of riches. The problem is, what am I doing with that material? So if you can start from that premise rather than the richness of the material premise, I'd be grateful. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Steve. Can I be heard? Yes. I wasn't going to say what great material. I was going to say I introduced you as the historian's historian for a reason, and I think you just proved that beyond belief today. I'm going to start with a question, if that's all right, and then we'll throw it open to the floor. I'm thinking about status. I'm thinking about worth. Are these people who are defined by employment, by land, by what they own? And you know here I'm referencing your erstwhile collaborator, Alex Shepherd.
Yes. So having said I've got great material, there are really significant gaps in it as well. And as you know, Alex Shepherd's remarkable book uses a series of sources that I've been working with here to orbit her principal source base, which is statements of worth made in the church courts. And although I do have some church court testimony which figures in some of my other chapters, it's nowhere near rich enough to allow the kind of systematic work that is done, it figures so prominently in Alex's book. So my answer is suggestive rather than definitive. And I think a great deal here in this particular community depends on one's relationship to the landlord. That is to say, whether you are in good standing with your landlord. I didn't quote any examples in today's talk, but Sir Richard Newdigate can be pretty vicious about those of his tenants who he regards as unreliable or immoral. But he's very supportive of those who pay their rents regularly and who are in good standing with him. I also think that occupational reputation is critical. It's a great surprise to me that more work hasn't been done on these groups of craftsmen, not just masons and bricklayers, but carpenters, blacksmiths, etc. And I think we would do well to learn a great deal more about the reputational standing of particular occupational groups. But it's a really good question, to which I don't have an easy answer. Does
Newdigate's religious predilections have anything to do with being in good standing?
Yeah, well, yes. So there is, without getting into the weeds, a fantastic episode that takes place in July of 1683 when the Sheriff of Warwick shows up at Arbury Hall, suspecting that Newdigate has been involved in the Rye House plot, and they take all his armaments away. And the following year, the jurors in the Court of Survey make some pretty snarky comments about loyalty to the king, that they are God-fearing and that they are loyal and their landlord maybe isn't. So there is an interesting dynamic that's kind of bubbling away about his confessional stance.
Wonderful, thank you very much. I'm going to open it out now to the audience. I very much welcome questions. Joe, Kathy, would you? And then I think I saw a hand at the. Come to you next.
Thanks, Steve. That was really fascinating. I was just wondering if you could talk about the census sources that we're using, who ordered them, why, and why were these communities chosen in particular?
Okay, so the manor of Griff and Coton is the preeminent of the three manors that the Newdigates own. The Court of Survey is commissioned by Sir Richard Newdigate himself in 1681, and it tasks the jurors with 25 articles of inquiry, and the first 23 of those are pretty standard manorial fare, the kind that I alluded to earlier: meres and bounds, mineral rights, rents, services, that type of thing. Articles 24 and 25 of the Court of Survey ask the jurors to collect information about the name, age and profession, not occupation, profession of each of the inhabitants or each of the heads of household. And Article 25 asks them to itemise which seat in the parish church they occupy. Those are the two anomalous articles which you wouldn't expect to find in any other manorial court of survey. So that raises the interesting question, why is Sir Richard Newdigate asking those questions? I used to think, and my first published attempt at answering that question is nearly 15 years ago now, I used to think that it was simple determination to maximise his landed resources. But the more work I've done on this, I think it's all connected with his ambitions to reopen the coal mines. And the reason he's interested in occupational data is he needs to know how many colliers live in the parish already and how many colliers he's going to need in order to exploit the mineral resources of the Griff coalfield to the full. There are in fact 16 coal miners resident in 1684. That's nowhere near enough. He needs to recruit vast numbers of colliers from adjacent and in some cases distant parishes as well. So I think this is all connected with his coal mining ambitions. Other listings of this kind were drawn up for a whole number of reasons. Some of you may know that Gregory King himself was implicated in some of them in the wake of the Marriage Duty Act of the 1694-1695 period. So far as I'm aware, this is the only occupational census that is part of a manorial survey. To that extent, it's anomalous. But the fact that it survives in a manorial archive with an associated map means that I'm a social historian who's died and gone to heaven.
Thank you very much. We have a question down here, please.
Oh, yes.
Or if you just...
Alan Warren.
Hi, Alan. Alan, do you want a microphone? Because it's for
I
the...
don't know whether other people want a microphone.
I think it's for the people who are live streaming in.
Sorry. It's really a question about context, given that I'm not a 17th century historian, let alone a historian of social England. What happened after Newdigate essentially was exiled, from the way you described it, from public life?
Right.
Because one of the things, as a hypothesis, and you'll be able to shoot down if I'm answering this question, is that he's untypical because he cannot re-engage in at least county society.
Right.
Bearing in mind that one of his successors was an MP for that part of Warwickshire for about 60 years in the 19th century.
Yes.
So is he unusual in being able to devote that amount of time and motivation to this exercise?
So my answer to your question would be yes, he is unusual, though he does find his way back into the Warwickshire Commission of the Peace by the early 1690s. And when there is a tumult in northeast Warwickshire associated with exploitation in the nail-making trade, it is Newdigate who's writing to the Secretary of State saying the mob is up. So he does gradually re-assimilate himself. I would say that he is anomalous as a personality as well. I described him as a control freak. He's a micromanager. He's got a temperamental inability to delegate anything to anybody. But interestingly, if you think of the survey that he asks to be created in the early 1680s, it takes 13 men 3 years to collect all that information. So, I mean, they say we really couldn't have done it without his vision. Well, yeah, okay, but that's false modesty. It's them that do the work. They collect the information. And I'm really interested in looking at the village through their eyes rather than his. But thank you for the question.
Thanks, Alan. We've got a question from Mark Jenner.
Hello, Mark. How are you? Good. Good to see you.
Please do indicate if you want to ask a question.
Thank you, Steve. That was really fascinating. My question, I suppose, is pushing you a bit on the relationship between materiality and social history, because you very much announced this as social history. Mm-hmm. And a lot of North American social scholars in the last 15 years have been talking about the need to think about more than human histories.
Yes.
And I was thinking, you know, particularly with your last slide about the horses.
Right.
But actually to think, if we're thinking about the energy sources that are so prominent in your story, whether it's about coal or human labour, I'm actually wondering about, if you like, the non-human inhabitants of that village, whether it's the cows that are being milked,
Yeah.
or the horses that are so important, you know, the right slap bang at the front of Bacon's image, or the vast investment in the stable. And I'm thinking, how might we think about those inhabitants? Is there a chapter missing from your book, if you like, to think about the subjectivity and the labour of some of those non-human inhabitants?
Yeah, so it's a really great question, and I take it very, very seriously. I was really interested in the recent work that's been done on the relationship between humans and animals, especially dairy herds, and the speculation about whether dairy workers, particularly farm wives, referred to cows by their names. That's certainly the case on the Jocelyn farm in Earl's Colne in the 1650s and 1660s. I've got no evidence that Anne Hardy, for instance, called her cows by name, but I would like to think that in my reconstruction of dairying practice, which is slightly richer in the written version of this than I was able to do justice to here, I take the materiality of human-animal relationships very seriously. I've thought a lot about the experience of appraisers coming into households and barns and being confronted with, you know, an individual's material assets, flitches of bacon, wheels of cheese. There's one spectacular inventory for an adjacent farm where there's an enormous collection of cheese in the dining room. What's it doing there? Is it put on display there for valuation purposes? I think those questions are really very interesting. I've tried to braid answers to them through the narratives of my various chapters. This project has changed a lot in its architecture over the 15 years that I've been working on it. Originally, I would have had a chapter on tenure and a chapter on coal and a chapter on clay. But the more and more I got into it, the appeal of trying to tell it through the lives of individual households and weaving through the kinds of questions that you're asking became more and more attractive. And for good or ill, that's what I've ended up with. But thank you for the question.
Only our own Mark Jenner could ask a man whose book is in the press, did you miss a chapter? We have a question from John Cooper down here, please.
Hey, John.
Thank you. Can I ask you a different kind of question?
Yeah.
Which is about your personal motivation for doing this kind of work.
Yeah.
Because you've given us a compelling account of how this can be done. So how what we probably thought couldn't be done can be done.
Right.
But you've also hinted just a couple of times about why it should be done.
Right.
And you quoted the condescension of posterity.
Yeah.
And then you talked about Thatcher's Britain in the 1980s.
Yeah.
There's something there that's interesting about recovering these voices, and this is work that needs to be done. What does you just talk to us personally about what is a heroic project that's been obviously been going on a long time? You know, how did you keep going, essentially?
How did I keep going? So, social history for me has to be three things. It has to be archivally rigorous, it has to be conceptually informed, and it has to be politically engaged. Otherwise, what's the point? So that's, I mean, Keith Wrightson used to call it fire in the belly. When I was a graduate student, maybe some of you in the room had this experience too. Mark and I are almost exact contemporaries. I remember reading Stephen Greenblatt's Shakespearean Negotiations, and that incredible opening sentence in that book, I began with a desire to speak with the dead. And I thought, yeah, that's what I want to do. I really want to speak with the dead. And then the more I thought about it, I'm not speaking with the dead at all. I'm speaking for them. And that's why it matters to me, and that's why I've never got bored of it. And it takes on an extra level of poignancy when you visit this place or other places like it. You know, I alluded to the fact that in successive waves it had been decimated. It's anybody here from Nuneaton? Right, just make sure I get that out of the way before I say what I'm about to say. But it's a pretty depressed, post-industrial place, opioid affected place. My eldest son used to play football, I nearly said soccer, football for Kenilworth against Nuneaton. And the football field, the pitch where they used to play, is on the site of the old common fields in Chilvers Coton, and there were drug syringes all the way around the end. And I thought, oh God, this is so depressing. And the moral of that story is that if you're going to study a place like this, do it from Southern California.
I think we'd all like to do it from Southern California. Do we have any further questions from the audience? Yes, Sarah.
Picks up from your last comment, actually. I was really struck by the age of Anne and Andrew as new parents.
Yes.
I wondered if you could comment more about that, either particularly or in general.
Yes, thank you for the question. So there is one section of the book that really does try and do the kind of historical demography that the Cambridge group were attracted to in this kind of source in the first place. The age at marriage in this parish is pretty much what you would expect from other Cambridge group studies. As you know, they were able to do family reconstitutions where the parish register evidence was much more robust. Part of my difficulty here is that the parish register only begins in 1654, and there are some unfortunate gaps in it, which means that I can't answer those questions as rigorously as I would want to. But yes, there are a large number of women who are only giving birth for the first time in their late 20s and sometimes later. So those kinds of questions are very, very important to me, and parts of the book do answer them. The funny thing is that this particular source, the occupational census type listing, ended up in the library of the Cambridge Group for the History of Population and Social Structure from 1965 onwards. And if you search any of the historical demography or stuff on age at first marriage, you'll see Chilvers Coton coming up again and again and again and again. But nobody had thought of going back to the Warwick Record Office to see what the matrix of the particular source was. And I had that opportunity, and here we are 15 years later.
Thank you. One final question? Anyone?
Bill.
Bill.
The man who taught me paleography.
Well, it's good effect, thank you. Get back to Andrew Harding, really.
Yeah.
And you raised the conundrum about was he a stonemason?
Yeah.
A farmer or a stonemason? You mentioned at one stage you worked for the Newdigates for 151 days, I think.
Yeah.
And there were two things about that. I wondered if that was seasonal or whether it was spread through the year, and that might help us to think about what's going on there.
Right.
And the other thing was he had a bull. And a bull seems to me to be a bit like being a miller. If you've got a bull in a village, you know, you've got a big source of money for you. And so I said, those two questions really are better teasing out a bit more about where you feel he falls on that.
Yeah, so this is a very, very difficult question, and I avoided the term by employment deliberately because I think we need to be a lot more sophisticated in our thinking about the relationships within a dual economy, especially where women's work is so central. The allocation of his time at Arbury Hall is seasonal, and interestingly, his apprentice, Charles Hall, who is his nephew, the same year that Andrew Hardy does 151 days, Charles Hall does something like 276. And that suggests to me that his apprentice is on site preparing materials, counting bricks, preparing the ground for a bricklaying spurt, as it were, when Hardy himself is not there. There's interesting work been done recently by Sebastian Quebec, who was associated with the Cambridge Group, looking at probate inventories. And he's got an interesting idea about whether you can ascribe the main occupational designation given in the inventory as the principal source of labour. And he's got some interesting ideas about number of beds in the household, etc., and the location of those beds. It's an interesting question. In the book, I paint the village carpenter as a farmer who does some woodwork. Actually, I think Hardy is a bricklayer who does some farming.
Thank you. I think we've grilled you, Steve.
I had a great time.
Thank you very much. And can I just say thank you to Kathy Moore for facilitating
Absolutely,
the question.
thank you. And thank you to the AV team as well. Great job.
Thank you to the AV team. Steve, you've given us the most extraordinary rich paper, and I'm struck by what you say about speaking for the dead and the enormous responsibility we have as historians to do justice to the lived experiences of people in the past, and I think that's exactly what you've done this evening. So thank you very much, and it behoves me to hand over to you to applaud Steve for this wonderful paper.
What a lovely introduction.
Colleagues, there's a glass of, I hope, chilled white wine, or red if you prefer, waiting for you outside. So please do move into the atrium, and we'll look forward to having a chat with Steve over a glass of wine. Thank you.